Hello, friends. Registration is now open for next year's Exiles in Babylon conference, and I cannot wait for this conference. Here's a few topics that we're going to wrestle with: the future of the church, disability in the church, multi-ethnic perspectives on American Christianity, and a conversational debate on the problem of evil and suffering. We have Eugene Cho, Elise Fitzpatrick, Matt Chandler, Michelle Sanchez, Justin Gibney, Devin Stahl, Lamar Hardwick. The list goes on and on. Joey Dodson's going to be there. Greg Boyd and Clay Jones, they're going to be engaging in this conversational debate on the problem of evil and suffering. And of course, we have to have Ellie Bonilla and Street Hymns back by popular demand. And Tanika Wyatt and Evan Wickham will be leading our multi-ethnic worship again. We're also adding a pre-conference this year. So we're going to do an in-depth scholarly conversation on the question of women in ministry, featuring two scholars on each side of the issue. So Doctors Gary Brashears and Sydney Park are on the complementarian side, and Doctors Cynthia Long Westfall and Philip Payne on the egalitarian side. So March 23rd to 25th, 2023, here in Boise, Idaho. We sold out last year and we'll probably sell out this year again. So if you want to come live, then I would register sooner than later. And you can always attend virtually if you can't make it out to Boise in person. So all the info is at theologyintherod.com. That's theologyintherod.com. Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is my friend Jay Kim. Jay is the lead pastor at WestGate Church in the Silicon Valley. He's also the author of Analog Church and the recently released Analog Christian, this book right here, which forms the better part of our conversation. We talk about all things digital related, and a big part of our conversation really focuses on just the addictive nature of social media and smartphones and the internet as a whole, which I think is a huge discipleship conversation that needs to be had and continue to be had. And that becomes a big part of our conversation. So please welcome back to the show, the one and only Pastor Jay Kim. Jay, you were on the podcast. If I remember correctly, it was right in the middle or at the beginning of the 2020 pandemic. Because you had wrote a book on like digital media and the church and everything, and it was so timely because everybody was going online. I don't know if you planned it. Obviously, you didn't plan it that way, but you just came out with another book, Analog Christian: Cultivating Contentment, Resilience, and Wisdom in the Digital Age. Can you, for those, why don't you just briefly describe your first book, and then let's dive into the second book and how do these play off each other?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's so fun chatting with you again, Preston. The first book, Analog Church, it was released in March of 2020. I remember the release date was like 2 weeks after our church had to shut down and not gather in person. And then I release a book about why it's so important to be in person. So that was, obviously super ironic, but in hindsight, it was, I'm grateful for it in a weird way, just because if there was anything I would want to say in the midst of the pandemic, it would have been that book. So that came out in March of 2020. It was really a book about the intersection between our ecclesiology and the digital age. It was a book I wrote mostly with church leaders and pastors in mind. This new book, Analog Christian, is still at the intersection of the digital age, but it's more about who we're becoming, discipleship or formation are sort of, the popular words to use. Mm-hmm. It's just about who we're becoming in light of the sort of digital air that we all breathe. And it's not a book about being a Luddite and throwing away all your technology. That's not who I am. Some people think that's who I am, but that's a misunderstanding. I have an appreciation for digital technology. I just think with all technologies and with all things really in life, we have to put them in their rightful place. So it's really a book about how we can be mindful and thoughtful to invite the Spirit of God to form us into the sorts of people God longs for us to be, rather than letting digital media and social media and the digital age form us into people that we don't want to be.
Mm-hmm. I just had on the podcast a guy named Doug Smith, who is a software engineer, great thinker. He wrote a book called Unintentional that talks about more of the addictive dangers of, in particular, social media, but I think just broadly smartphones and other things. It was talking to him. I mean, it was like you saw The Social Dilemma, right, on Netflix.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have
Yeah.
Netflix, so he hadn't seen, but he knows about the documentary. But a lot of what he was saying very much was similar to what we saw in that movie, which was frightening. I
Yeah.
mean, and it's if it's even half true, that should raise all kinds of alarm bells. But I don't
Yeah.
see any chance. I don't know. I think people. Here's my. I guess this is getting to a question. It seems like a very urgent matter that we are being co-opted and used by,
Yeah.
for lack of better terms, big tech or whatever you want to call it. And we keep going. We keep doing it. We're like enslaved to these devices and social media. We know it's producing more anger and disunity in the church, and it's
Yeah.
not. It's leading to anxiety and depression, and I mean, and yet we just keep on going. Like, what do you address some of
Yeah.
that in the book? And
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's probably a universal sentiment for most people, at least living in the modern West, sort of shackled to their digital devices. Yeah, I mean, we're addicts, right? Most people are digital addicts. Most people don't want to admit that, or they don't recognize it. There's like all sorts of studies done. The average smartphone user, I think, touches their phone like 2,500 times a day. iPhone, Apple actually just released some data a year or two ago about the average iPhone user unlocking their phone. I think it's like 150 times a day. That's average.
wow.
And when people hear those statistics, nobody's like, "Oh yeah, I do that." Everyone's like, "That's insane. What all those crazy people out there." But if you actually kept track, like literally counted, you'd quickly realize, no, that's you. Like you probably open your phone 150, 200 times a day. And we just don't know it because we're so addicted. It's so pervasive and ubiquitous in our lives. And, it's interesting, right? That word addict comes from a Latin word that, in the Greco-Roman world was used to describe slaves. It was a legal term used in the court of law to describe when a person would be deemed the property of another person. So to be an addict is to be a slave. And that's exactly what you said. We are truly enslaved to these devices. And so I think awareness of that, it's so interesting. The social dilemma on Netflix, I think it was like the number one documentary on Netflix for several months running. Yeah. And they've done some studies about, it was like tens of millions of people watched it, and globally. And they did some studies shortly thereafter, like, did it have any sort of real effect on people's smartphone usage? And it's kind of early to tell, but the early data shows like, no, not really. So it's interesting. There's a real distance, a chasm between information, knowledge, like knowing the stuff. And like you're saying, I felt the same way. It's like, this is frightening. It's alarming. It's frightening. This is, it's a major problem. That's destructive in so many ways. But when it comes to like, what are we going to do about it? Mm-hmm. We don't do much about it, because when you're an addict, it's like addicts know that this is destroying their lives. And yet they keep going. When it comes to alcohol, for example, they just like can't help it. They keep going back to the bottle. And I think we're in a very similar sort of precarious and, like you said, frightening situation.
So what, have you ever preached on this? Or I wonder, because I don't, it's typically not like a pulpit conversation. And yet I would suggest, and correct me if I'm wrong, addiction to social media is one of the main hindrances to discipleship in the church. And we saw this when every single pastor I talked to, you're a pastor, I can ask you the same question. Like, what was it? How difficult was it discipling your people in 2020? And why is that? It wasn't like, oh, it's hard to prepare a sermon or people had theological problems. It was like debates about masks and lockdown measures and the race conversation and politics and stuff that all comes down to what's the steady drip that they're getting from whatever social media outlet or whatever. So much of it went down to that, right? Like that's why people were angry and divisive. And if there was no like internet, it wouldn't have
Yeah.
been, we would have just had just the pandemic, to worry about.
Yeah.
But we
Yeah.
wouldn't have all the division in the church and families.
Yeah.
So is that an overstatement that I mean, figuring out a better way to not be enslaved to something that is just really, destroying the church might be too strong, but dividing the church is probably not
Yeah.
strong enough. I mean,
No, I agree with you. I agree totally. So to answer the first question, yeah, we at our church we have preached on it,
okay,
and actually we also drip in, the influence and formational power of social media and news media and the digital age. We drip that sort of thing in
yeah.
all the time,
So it's in the
not
air.
because
It's in the air of the church that like this is people are just there's an awareness of
yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if you were to ask our folks, hey, how often do the teachers here talk about social media and digital media, news media? I think if for folks who are around for a bit and pretty regularly, I think most of them would tell you like, oh yeah, it comes up quite a bit actually.
Okay.
And for us, it's not because we're trying to like touch some hot button issue. It's because we think it's so formational. It is like it's so ubiquitous. It's just the air we breathe. Therefore, what that means is it's forming our people. So if it's interesting. Neil Postman, I think a lot of listeners will at least know his name. He was writing, gosh, 40 years ago, 30, 40 years ago. But if you read his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, it's prophetic in the sense that it feels like he wrote the book two days ago.
I've said
And
this
he's
many
got this,
times, yeah.
he's got this whole thing about how technology has changed ideas. And we see this today in ways that he didn't even see when he was writing the book. But he basically talks about how, like, the telegraph changed everything, right? Late 19th century, Samuel Morse, famous for the Morse code.
Yeah.
He develops the telegraph, right? Like electrical wires, and you can send signals. And now you can send ideas and information across long stretches of land and then eventually even across the sea, because by like 1890 or something, they had developed a line between America and Europe, so across the Atlantic. And now with so much immediacy, you can share ideas and information. Well, before the telegraph, the fastest that information could travel was like 35 miles an hour on a train.
Yeah.
So what he talks about, what Postman says is before the telegraph, ideas, because they traveled slow, ideas were almost always local, and therefore ideas and information, it was almost always local, and it was almost always for the sake of doing something with the idea or information. Like it was pertinent to where you lived and the people you were doing life with and how it affected your town or your neighborhood or whatever, and you had to do something with it. And then he says the telegraph introduced a whole new thing, and he calls it introduced the idea of ideas and information as a commodity. And then he talks about how television took it a step further,
Right.
and it turned ideas and information not just into a commodity, but into entertainment.
Right.
And now you think about the internet, and you're talking about division amongst Christians and all these arguments we have online about X, Y, and Z. And it's like, the question I always have is, we're screaming at each other online, but how does this make any tangible difference in your house, in your home, your neighborhood, your workplace, your church, your city? It's like it's a fascinating thing, and it's formational, right? We've just sort of become enraptured in this milieu of ideas as commodity and entertainment, and now really as like bullets in our digital guns, or just like shoot each other in the wild west of the internet for no good reason, while like our real lives aren't being formed in the way that we want them to. So I think Postman was really prescient in that way. And I think we need to take heed of that and consider how the internet is forming us.
Someone just told me that one of his students, because that's the book is so prophetic, and you're just like, oh, I wish he was still alive today to write part 2. But somebody told me one of his students did write a book, I think maybe 10 years ago, kind of saying, here's what here's how this would apply today, or something like that. Have you heard of that book?
No, I haven't, but I'm gonna look it up now.
Yeah, I forgot the name of it, and I looked at the sales rank, and it's like in the millions, so it's not. It doesn't seem like it's a really
Hmm.
popular book, but yeah, I would,
Hmm.
because yeah, that book. I mean, Postman. I've said this a lot. That it's like he was writing yesterday. Like how the
Yeah,
things he said, and he was talking about television primarily, right? That the medium of television shapes the very thing we're doing. It is created
yeah,
um an entertainment industry out of news, right? Because you want somebody that's good looking
yeah,
on the whatever, you need to capture attention. Um and then fast forward now to even the political arena, and now so much of it is performance, right? And so when
yeah,
people treat it as anything other than that, I think that's wrongheaded. But so I'm going back to your church, because I did this is identifying the problem is pretty easy, but I'm like, how do we alert people to the discipleship, ecclesiological dangers of having this steady drip of propaganda, or whether it's a news outlet or just social media, or people just vying not just for your attention or your wallet, which they are, but also your affections. Like
yeah,
they purposely want you to be angry, because that's going to
yeah.
keep you on there. They want you to be addicted. They want you to keep scrolling and keep. We know this. How do we wean people off it? So when you said this, I'm curious. Well, both you say you have preached on it, but also the kind of steady drip. Can you talk
Yeah.
to what does each of those look like? The preaching and the steady
Yeah.
drip.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, you said some of the words; those are verbatim words we use here. And for some people, it might feel like we're talking about it ad nauseum. It's just like, oh my gosh,
Okay.
this again, because we sort of repeat ourselves like a broken record. But one of the reasons is because we just our people keep, and myself, like self indictment here, we just all keep doing the same thing. So we just like keep repeating what some of the words you said, like these technologies and these tools, they're not neutral.
Right.
They're non-neutral technology. So it's very different than a hammer. Like a hammer, just like any technology, a hammer can be used for good or it can be used for harm. But a hammer doesn't sit there and blink and glow and ask you to pick it up for no good reason, whereas the smartphone does.
Hmm.
And it's in our back pocket. And the hammer's utility is super clear. But a smartphone, because of the way it's designed now, I mean, think about it. How often do you use your smartphone as a phone? It's like very rarely.
Right.
It's kind of silly. We call it a smartphone. It's a computer in our
Right.
back pocket. It's access to the World Wide Web. And so we talk about a lot how this technology in particular is vying for your attention, your affection, and then we take it a step further, and what we say is ultimately what it really wants is your allegiance. It
Right.
wants you to bow at the altar of technology. And it doesn't call itself technology. It calls itself all sorts of beautiful things like being connected and information and being up to date, whatever, all that kind of stuff. So the way it looks for us is we've done like a mini series on formation and technology, some of it sort of out of my book. And then really for us, just as a church, and different churches have different sort of modes of operation. Just our sense for our people here in Silicon Valley, we think discipleship to Jesus, formation into Christ likeness is of utmost importance. We feel like that's, as a church, that's what
Hmm.
we're sort of called to call our people to. So that makes it really easy for us because we talk so much about formation into Christ likeness. It gives us very open access and avenues to talk about, well, what are the things that are forming us?
Okay.
And that almost always comes down to a number of things, but one of the things is digital technology, social media, news media. So that's why it comes up quite a bit. And then the other thing we've found really helpful, sort of borrowing from like guys like Jamie Smith, we talk a lot about how just knowing stuff, information is critically important, right? We value robust, rich theology and biblical narrative, all those sorts of things. We've got to know that stuff, but knowing it doesn't change you. you've got to allow the knowledge and the information. You've got to participate with it. Those are Peter's words at the beginning of one of his letters. You got to make every effort,
Right.
participate with the Spirit of God, with the knowledge that you have. And what that does then is it reorients and reforms your desires. And I think that's really at the heart of the matter for us. We're trying to figure out a way, and it's a slow and steady process, doesn't happen overnight, but we're trying to figure out a way where we can help our people begin to desire the wrong things less and less and desire the right things more and more. So when it comes to digital technology, one of those things might be to desire engagement in the sort of social media landscape less and less. So one of the things we've invited our church to do is like the 1 a month challenge. So it's like so hokey to call it that, but it just makes sense. It's like we invite our folks like, hey, for the next year, can you delete or have like a net negative of -1 on the number of apps on your phone? Like at least every month, can you delete an app and just see how that goes? And a year from now, hopefully you've got 12 less apps on your phone than you did a year before. If you just keep going, I think what you will find is, no, like you can manage and live a rich, meaningful life without all of that clutter on your smartphone that's just constantly vying for your attention and affection and allegiance. So
yeah, have you seen people change? Have you seen the last couple of years or whatever, like an improvement in people's? I know it's hard to measure, but I mean,
yeah. Anecdotally, for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Anecdotally, as I just think about like the small group I belong to. There's 9 guys. It's like 18 of us. It's a young marrieds small group. But like the husbands get together one week, the wives another week. So out of the 9 guys, 4 of them work at Apple, and then 2 of them work at other tech companies. So like 2/3 work in tech. They're like in the business of making the stuff that's so ubiquitous in our lives. And yeah, we talk about it quite a bit. And as we talk about it, yeah, I've seen it. I've seen these sort of incremental but really profound and beautiful changes in some of our lives. And it's little things, but it's the little things that are big things. It's stuff like, like I'm spending more time with my kids, or I've got this practice in place where now I come home and there are no phones outside of sort of the kitchen. So we have a docking station in the kitchen.
Yeah.
We leave our phones there. And from the moment I get home till the kids are in bed, the phones are away and we're just spending time together as family. These sorts of little things, I think, I've seen. And I think it's had a profound impact. It's had a profound impact on my life, but I've watched it have a profound impact on their lives as well. So, and it goes beyond that. It goes beyond my small group. So yeah, anecdotally, we've seen progress, and that's, I think, worth celebrating.
Did you guys face, as a church, a lot of the kind of just divisiveness, like since 2020, really? I mean, and I don't know.
Yeah.
I haven't really talked to people much about it in the last like 6 months. Has it died down? Has it gotten better? But I mean, gosh, during 2020, I mean, people were fleeing this church for that church because of different responses to the pandemic, or they were, they were preaching politics too much or not enough, or the wrong kind of politics. I mean, it was just, it was pretty disastrous. Some churches, it was disastrous. I talked to a small handful of pastors that said it was difficult, but it, wasn't, we got through it. Most pastors said this is the most difficult, like, pastoring I've ever had to do. Did you guys face a lot of that? Just the division over all the hot button issues?
Yeah, we for sure did. As I talked to pastor friends of mine around the country as well, I think where we had a situation that I think has been common in other cities like ours. Our church, so during the pandemic early on, we committed to doing everything we could to continue fostering what was already a very strong relationship with our county and our city. So we just said, okay, no matter how hard it gets, we're going to do our absolute best to sort of work with them and adhere to the rules and regulations. And I'm in Silicon Valley, which is in Santa Clara County. We were actually the first county in the entire country to shut down.
Oh, wow.
And we were the last to totally open.
Wow.
And and that had a tremendous effect on churches, obviously.
Right.
But we tried our best to adhere, and we did adhere to county rules and regulations. We would tell them like, hey, this is why we feel like it's unnecessary, or this is making it really challenging for us, but we're going to do what you're asking us. We just need you to know, like, if there's a little wiggle room here, can you work with us, sort of thing. And they were actually pretty generous. But all of that to say, like other cities like ours, there was one church in our town that did the major sort of like, this is the devil, the government is Satan, and they are trying to squelch the work of the Spirit. So we're not doing anything. We're going to gather. We're going to jam pack our room, no masks, nothing. And
we're going to sit extra close to each other.
I serve it. Yeah. I serve at a church that's, fairly large. We had, it's not an overstatement to say we had like hundreds probably of people upset that we were not gathering. And then when we gathered, that we were wearing masks, and they left and they all went to that one church. So that one church, I don't know how they're doing now. I just don't think anger is a good way to build a community, but that's my opinion. They went from like, I think pre-pandemic they had maybe like 300 people or something. And I heard at one point they had to go to like 3 services and they had like 1,500 people or something. It's like every angry Christian that was like, no masks, COVID is a lie, they all sort of gathered in this one place, So we certainly had that. The political stuff was challenging too, but it didn't hit us as hard. I felt like we navigated that decently well, but still, we had some effects with, social justice issues and all of that. So we've definitely felt it. But we did a survey like 9 months ago at our church, and 50% of our church has been at our church 3 years or less. So like half our church is like pandemic people. So it's like the internal mantra for our staff right now is, hey, we're learning a new church in a new city. And it's a new city because here in Silicon Valley, we had a mass exodus in the last few years, people just moving away up to Boise, Idaho and other places, So, it's a new church in a new city. And that's been really exciting for us, just trying to figure out, what this new chapter looks like.
Yeah. But you mentioned Boise. We get a lot of Californians here, a lot of people from Oregon, Washington. Well, it's funny because the natives here, the native to Boise, they just think, California, that's a liberal state, and all these liberals are coming up here. I'm like, you're not getting the liberals, dude. You're getting the hardcore conservatives that are willing to uproot and move states for political reasons, and they're not. Which I mean, if I think politically, it just seems that this post-pandemic shuffle is going to make red states even redder and blue states maybe perhaps even bluer. I don't know. Whatever. Who cares? Yeah. What do you what are you doing to prepare your people for what will probably be another very divisive election cycle in 2024? Is this something you're anticipating? Or you said you weren't hit, your church wasn't as divisive around politics as much as maybe some other churches. So maybe it's not a huge thing you need to anticipate, or.
Yeah, I mean, no, we're still bracing for it. If I had to guess, I mean, here, Santa Clara County, Silicon Valley, San Jose, it generally, the area is a very blue,
right.
It's very progressive liberal. If I had to guess, this is very anecdotal, about our church, I'd probably guess if people had to lean one way or the other, like if you forced them to politically, my guess is that our church, our congregation would be like 60% blue, 40% red-ish, something like that. But I actually think the majority of our congregation, like 80% of our congregation, is more along the lines of like what Jonathan Haidt calls the exhausted majority, they have some leanings for sure. Like if you were to say like, okay, what about this issue or that issue? Sure, you could kind of shade them bluish or reddish, but I think the majority of them are like, dude, I'm just tired of this. I want to get along and I want to move forward, and I'm here not because the pastor's going to tell me to vote for this guy or that guy. I'm here because I want to figure out this Jesus thing,
Right.
And so if there is some criticism that's lobbed our way, it might be something along the lines of, you're not talking about politics enough. Although I would suggest we talk about politics a lot. And I think it's a political statement to say, and we say this all the time, like, the path to human flourishing does not run through the White House. It runs through the cross at Calvary. Yeah. Our allegiance is not to an elected official. Our allegiance is to Jesus as King. Those are literally words we say probably every Sunday in some form or fashion. So I think that's how we're trying to prepare our people. And we're, if we're ready for anything, I think we're ready for the loss of those who are going to be angry because we're not making blatantly political statements in the way they want us to make them. Yeah. And I'm okay with that. There are other churches in the area that do that, and, God bless you as you go there. But yeah, generally, I think our church is made up of the exhaustive majority, and we're just going to try to serve them well.
Where did Haidt talk? Was that in Righteous Mind, or was that more recently?
No, where I first read it wasn't in one of his books. Although he might have talked about it in Coddling of the American Mind. But I read it first in an Atlantic article he wrote that came out probably 6 months ago.
Yeah, that's good.
I forget the name of it. It's something along the line. The title was great. It's something along the lines of like, why the last 10 years of America have been so profoundly stupid, or something like that. So
that's a great article. I don't think I read the whole thing.
Incredible.
Yeah. He always does that. He'll drop these bomb articles in the Atlantic like once every few years, and they're just so prophetic. And then he writes a book about it. Yeah. Well, talk to me about your book, Analog Christian. What's I was looking at the table of contents, but can you walk us through it? And what do you hope the readers will walk away with?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. I'm trying to identify some of the symptoms of our digital addictions, and there's like probably dozens of them. But the book is a much more personal book than my first book. It's really, I wrote it as a prayer and as a confession. So I identified these symptoms of my own personal digital addictions over the years. And what I discovered in sort of long before I was even going to write this book, what I discovered was that, Paul's really profound words in his letter to the Galatians, that famous passage about the fruit of the Spirit and these beautiful characteristics of the Spirit's fruit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. As I sort of pondered that reality, what I realized is like, if the Spirit of God can have his way in me and form me into the sort of person God longs for me to be, and that leads to my life bearing the sort of fruit that only the Spirit of God can grow in me, those characteristics of the Spirit's fruit, man, those are the antidotes to so many of the symptoms I experience in the digital age. So essentially the book just breaks down like, if the Spirit of God moves in us, we're going to experience love instead of self-centric despair, joy instead of comparison, peace instead of contempt, patience instead of impatience, kindness and goodness instead of hostility, faithfulness instead of forgetfulness. And by forgetfulness, I don't mean like forgetting where your keys are. I mean, forgetting that it's a real human on the other side of this thing, and forgetting that our allegiance is to Christ, not to information or data or whatever, gentleness instead of outrage, self-control instead of reckless indulgence. So those symptoms are all symptoms that I was experiencing in my own life over the course of many years as I found myself sort of continuing to spiral into my digital addiction. And as I began sort of asking God prayerfully, okay, God, I want to be freed of this. I want to live a liberated life where I can still use digital technology, where I don't need to run from it, but I can put it in its proper place. So help me to do that, and help me to do that by your Spirit, cultivate this fruit in me. And it's a process that obviously I'm still in. It's a process I think I'll continue to be in for the rest of my life. But I have experienced in the last several years leading up to the book and then writing the book and releasing it, it's true. Like if we give ourselves over to the Spirit of God and what He wants to cultivate in our lives, liberation and freedom from our digital addictions, it is possible. And it really is. That's the life we really want to live, So that's the book. That's, the book came from that own sort of self-diagnosis, and I'm hopeful that it'll be helpful to some.
What like, could you tease out what your digital addiction looked like? Like, what was it for you? Because I know everybody probably has different things, whether it's a certain social media platform or just news or whatever.
Yeah, for me, it was primarily email and then Twitter.
Okay.
Like, I found myself incessantly checking my email, and it wasn't because I needed to. It was, when I began doing some self work, I realized it was actually it's just, I think this is common for a lot of people who do the same. It's just like deeply connected to my own insecurity and my sense of significance. And, every time I got that dopamine hit of like the ping of the email, it was like, oh, I matter. I'm important. If I don't address this, then everyone's screwed. So, it was like a lot of that kind of stuff. And then, social media, Twitter specifically, not that I was posting a lot, but I was finding myself doom scrolling that thing, and my entire worldview being framed and shaped by my, feed that the sort of machine algorithm was feeding me, so,
email. I don't typically hear email thrown in there, but when I can totally see that quest for significance, or somebody reached out to me, or what about it's almost like is there some new email that's like a book offer or this or that, or some kind of like status elevation or something, or a positive review. There's all kinds of stuff where you like, every time you check it, it's like, oh, is there something here, something here, something here? I can totally see that.
It was totally that. It's essentially like the slot machine, right? I was like a gambling addict sitting in the casino, and I'm just pulling that lever. It's like, is it going to come up? Like, oh, there it is. There's the email that affirms, my significance or whatever. And so that's a big reason why I wrote the book, actually.
And then Twitter, I've been pretty good with, for the most part, I don't like scroll. Like, I'll post stuff. I'll check notifications, who commented, whatever. And even that, I'm like, I probably shouldn't. I don't need to do that. But I wouldn't say I spend much time at all on it. But I would say in the last few days, for whatever reason, I've been hitting the home thing where I just look at. I've been kind of scrolling, kind of in a boredom, and I'm reminded again how much of a cesspool it is. It's like, and then it's sad. I was just talking about this to Doug Smith on the podcast the other day. Like, it's so, because if you do that a few times, you begin to see the kind of same people just living on, like, Twitter is their world, and I'm like, oh my gosh. Because I get a glimpse of it, and it's like, ugh, like, can you imagine if this was like your life? And like, oh my gosh, for some people, this occupies a huge part of their emotions, their connection, their involvement. Like, this is their world,
Yeah.
And that's like, that's just so, it's sad and eerie. Like, oh, that's so, it's sad, and you just live in a constant state of anger and bitterness and yelling at somebody, and ugh. Yeah. Did you experience that kind of what you were talking about? Like, you got sucked into that?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, again, I would not wade into those waters by like posting and replying a bunch, but I did find myself just glued to the interactions, and it's
entertaining. There's an entertainment factor there. I mean,
100%. Yeah, and there's like, I would find myself sort of like feeling so much contempt inside. In psychology, they talk about how contempt works up and down. They say you envy up and scorn down. And I found myself doing that on Twitter all the time.
What does that mean? Post. Can you explain that more? Envy up
Yeah,
and
so essentially the way contempt works, contempt is always directional, right? Contempt is not, you don't hold contempt for yourself. You hold all sorts of other things toward yourself, insecurity or, I mean, I guess sometimes there can be, like, this gets really destructive and dark for people when they, it's like, this is really dark, but like suicidal ideation comes from, in some ways, like self-contempt. Like I
okay.
can't bear, I'm so angry at me sort of thing. But generally speaking, contempt is directional. So it extends out from me to someone in a particular direction. So in the world of psychology, they say it depends on the direction. But when you feel contempt towards somebody that you sort of in a strange way admire or revere, but you feel contempt because you long to be where they are sort of thing.
Okay.
The way the contempt looks is envy. So it's interesting because we think envy is like, oh, they should be flattered. I envy them. It's actually a form of contempt. You
Interesting.
actually have a real sense of like envy and contempt dance together, So that's what contempt looks like toward those you sort of, admire or revere or think you do. And then they talk about how contempt toward those that you're just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they would, or I
Yeah.
can't believe they said. That's scorn. You're just scorned down. So envy up, scorn down. And in so many ways, I think Twitter is just when people use Twitter that way, that's literally what's happening. You're just envying up. I mean, like
Huh.
Instagram, as another example, is a perfect example of this. Instagram is like the envying up sort of machine. You're just constantly
Yeah.
scrolling the feed, envying everybody, but it's actually a form of contempt. You're planting seeds of real bitterness toward these people
Yeah.
for like no fault of their own. Like it's not their fault. They're just posting whatever it is they want to post, but because you constantly scroll the feed, you're starting to build bitterness. Like, why doesn't my life look like their life? And it's a sort of
Yeah.
envying up.
Yeah.
And then scorn down. This happens a lot, I think, on Twitter. Happens a ton on Facebook, where especially with political things,
Yeah.
it's just like, oh my gosh, did you see what so and so posted about such and such? And it's just scorn. It's like
Hmm.
complete contempt, and it's so dismissive, and there's all sorts of like neurological things happening when we do that. And those things have been tracked and mapped. It's not conjecture. It's not hypothetical. It's like neurologists have mapped it. Like
Yeah.
there's stuff happening in our brain chemistry when we do that. That's killing us. It's destructive,
Wow.
but it's also hyper addictive. Like
Yeah.
most things are, like smoking cigarettes kills you and it's hyper addictive.
Yeah.
Drinking too much alcohol kills you and it's hyper addictive.
Yeah.
And so it is with social media.
Golly. But it's I think we get away like we don't treat the addiction to social media as severe because it's not a chemical, right? Like we're like, "Oh yeah, maybe
Yeah.
we could joke about being addicted," but no one would say like, "Yep, I'm still addicted to crack," and move on,
Right.
so it's kind of a
Yeah.
socially acceptable addiction and people don't because it's not a chemical, people don't see how harmful it is, but it neurologically as you said, it's just incredibly harmful all the way down to all the way down, even if you're not actually addicted to, say, a social media, whatever, just that constant checking, it is lowering, right? I mean, you tell me, lowering our attention span, our ability to concentrate. Like
Yeah.
I've noticed this, and I might be in the category of somebody who scoffs at people who check their phone 150 times a day, and I probably check it maybe 120 times. I do in my honest self-evaluation, I think I'm probably below. Yeah, for sure, I'm below average, but that's still higher than I would like to be for sure.
Yeah.
Um, where's I going with it? Oh, but so I've noticed in my life, like reading a book, especially, I have to put my phone somewhere else, otherwise,
Yeah.
or even when I'm reading and I'll see a footnote, I'm like, oh, I should probably order that book, and I'll go to the phone, order it, and then
Yeah.
check Twitter, and
Yeah.
like, oh, I got a message on. And you can't that for somebody like you and I and other people who are in like our job is deep work. It is deep thinking. It
Yeah.
is you got to get you have to be our jobs revolves around being able to concentrate, right? I mean, whether it's preparing a
Yeah.
message or thinking through something or in a counseling situation or whatever. So, has that been pretty much proven that it's really diminishing our attention spans and our ability to kind of do the kind
Yeah.
of deep thoughtful work?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when you say deep work, I think a lot of people think of Cal Newport because he wrote
Yeah,
a book called
yeah.
Deep Work a few
I
years
was,
ago.
yeah,
And it's a fantastic book, and he talks about science-based, research-based. He talks about how he's got this phrase that I found so helpful. He calls it frenetic shallowness.
huh.
And he says, and this is not him sort of waxing poetic, this is him talking about what the science is revealing to us. He says, the more and more you wire your brain for frenetic shallowness. And frenetic shallowness
Mm,
is exactly what you're talking
yeah,
about. You're reading a book, you see a footnote, and you're like, oh, I gotta, and then you like break your train of
yes,
thought
yes,
from the ideas of the book and you go to your phone. Amazon is like, oh, it'll be really quick. But what Cal Newport talks about is like, no, it's not that quick, because the way your brain works, there is a gap and a chasm there. It takes time for you to snap out of, and
yes.
then for you to
Get back
re-engage
into, yeah.
deeply. It's not immediate the way you think it is. Like, your eyes are looking at the words on the pages of your book right away after you order the book on Amazon. Your mind, though, is not engaging the way it did when you had been sitting for an hour
Mm-hmm.
reading. And for you to get back to that state of mindfulness and deep thought, it takes a lot of time. But the problem is, before you can take that time to re-engage, there's another footnote. And you're like, oh, great, I got to get that. And then there's a text, and you're like, oh, one quick second, let me just text back. And then you're bored, and you're like, well, I just text Instagram really quick. And that's frenetic shallowness,
Yeah.
And when you do that, the real danger, Cal Newport says, and Nicholas Carr, in his book The Shallows, he gets deep into the
Mm,
neurology of this as well. The real danger is not just what's happening in that moment. The real danger is neuroplasticity, which is like a
right.
fancy way of saying, some people have heard the phrase like, neurons that fire together wire together.
Mm-hmm.
And what all that means really is your brain is, there's plasticity to it. So it can change and rewire. And what Newport and Nicholas Carr and others have said is, the more and more you ingrain yourself in frenetic shallowness, that's not just a problem when it's happening. Your brain now is rewiring,
Mm-hmm.
one, to desire that sort of frenetic shallowness, and two, to decrease in ability and aptitude to do deep work. So
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree, for you and I, especially for anybody that does deep work, like they have to think
Mm-hmm.
deeply about ideas. We are living in precarious and
Mm-hmm.
dangerous times,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the loss of boredom is another big one. You think
Yeah.
about waiting in line for something.
Yeah.
There's some research that's being done recently that's showing that boredom is actually one of the most important pathways to creativity, like
Really.
deep creativity. And so there's some people are starting to say, like, we may have passed the most creative era in sort of human history because nobody is bored anymore. And we may see like just less and less creativity in the
Mm-hmm.
generations to come, which is, sad. I mean, just utterly tragic. So, yeah.
That part when you're talking earlier about, yeah, I read the book a while ago, Cal Newport's book, which I would highly recommend to anybody listening. Super eye opening. I made some changes in my life after reading that, and I slowly drifted back into just kind of a bit more scattered, just
Mm.
not being as vigilant to be able to engage in deep work, which I want to get back into that. Because yeah, I just is it as simple as, like he even said, like shut off your email, don't be online if you're doing some writing, thinking, don't have your phone nearby. um have you found that to be largely a huge first step? I mean, to be able to get
Yeah.
back to
Yeah. I'm,
cultivating better rhythms of deep work.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is descriptive, not prescriptive necessarily, because I think, people are different and you got to figure out what works for you. For me, that's totally true. So, just to get super practical, when I'm preparing a sermon or writing, whether it's a book or an article or something, or doing anything that requires me to sink deeply into
Mm-hmm.
thought, and it's always structured in two different sort of modes. So I have research mode, and when I'm researching, I've got the internet up, and I've got my Kindle with, my books and quotes, and I'm doing all of that work, but I never write in that mode. Like I'm never writing words that are that other people are going to read. I'm literally putting together notes.
Okay.
And the notes always look like sermon notes, whether it's an actual sermon or a book or an article or something. I just put together a bunch of notes. But when I write, like when I have to sit down and do research is deep work as well. But when I want to do put my soul into writing something, I turn off my I have no internet connection. I print my notes, like paper notes. I print them out. And then I just have a silly program I paid like $10 on the App Store for called Write Room, like Write Room, WRITE Room, all one word. And it's so dumb, but it's so profoundly helpful. All it does is it blacks out my computer. And it's literally just a cursor and words and a black screen. That's it. So I can't see anything else. My phone is away, and I've got my printed paper notes, and then I'm just like writing and tweaking.
Interesting.
At that point. That's been hugely helpful for me.
Okay, that's good. Going back to Twitter, I'm curious. This is change the subject. Do you have thoughts on Elon taking over Twitter?
Oh my gosh. Well, it's right here in my neck of the woods, and my brother-in-law used to work for Twitter.
Oh yeah.
So he and I were just talking a couple weeks ago, and I was asking him. He hasn't worked there for several years, but I said, "Man, do you still have colleagues or friends there? And what are they saying?"
Yeah.
And he said, "Yeah, he does." And it's interesting, this gets to the social media thing. He said, "Yeah, I mean, Elon seems like he's crazy and sort of like nuts, but he's not the sort of," what my brother-in-law said was, he's not the sort of crazy that social media and news media is making him out to be. He said, that just makes for a really good news story. And it's so funny because it's all over Twitter. So it's like helping Elon with his own bottom line kind of thing. But he said, actually, there is a sort of sensibility in what he's doing here. And my brother-in-law was talking about in not all big tech, but in social media tech companies, his experience has been, and he's been in that space for a long time, his experience has been that there is a lot of sort of ideation that isn't really work. It's just kind of walking around talking about how they're going to change the world. So he said, I think, his opinion, Elon's just cleaning house and trying to bump up the bottom line. So I don't know, man. I don't know what's going to happen. Like there's that's kind of the business side of it, but there's, like the free speech side of things. And I don't know. One thing I think that's been helpful for me is it's been a good sort of reminder, oh, God has done some good work in me, because I have thought about oh, what if Twitter just completely shuts down? How would I feel? Even just with some of, you and I, we create work that, is public. I mean, you create really public work. Some of my work is somewhat public, and it's oh, what would happen? Will publishers be upset because there's no Twitter and we can't, And I realized I don't really care.
Yeah.
If Twitter went away tomorrow, I don't think I would bat an eye. And thank the Lord for that, because I don't think I would have been in the same space a couple of years ago.
Well, I did see people talking about, is Twitter going to shut down or all that? What's that based on? Because he just literally spent billions of dollars to buy. Why would it shut down? And it seems that the stats seem to be it's at its highest user level it's ever been. What is that? Just random fear?
Yeah,
stuff, I don't.
No,
but I saw several people talking about
some
that.
Of the fear I think some of the fear has gone away. What I read was one, some of their highest level engineers were resigning, and then two, there was one specific team. And there's some sort of back end team that if they don't do what they're supposed to do, the application itself wouldn't work. And that entire team, I don't know if that means hundreds of people or a few dozen, but supposedly the rumor on Twitter was that the entire team collectively resigned. So I think when all of that stuff started buzzing online, it was when that happened. This particular team had stepped down, and they're oh, this thing might shut down tomorrow. But it didn't. It didn't.
Yeah.
That's the point. Still like going strong.
Well, he's pretty smart. Whatever you think about it, he's a pretty smart dude. I would hope if he spent $40 billion, whatever, he would figure out how to run the app. I don't know. But,
exactly.
I don't know that whole world. Yeah, because I'm so just not invested in the culture wars and stuff. To me, it is almost like, I treat it almost like watching a TV show, because it kind of is, the old Postman, right?
Yeah,
It's like, so to me, it's just, there's just an entertainment value. Like, yeah. I've been scrolling his account here and there, and it's like actually hilarious. If you're not invested, if you just don't really care too much, it's actually really hilarious. Like he's like people complaining about the blue check mark thing, and you have some disgruntled person yelling, and he's like, "Thanks for your feedback. That'll be $8."
Yeah, totally.
It's hilarious.
Totally.
Like it's so funny.
I know.
And people think that like yelling at Twitter is really gonna affect Elon Musk, or like as if he like stays up late looking at all the critiques on Twitter or whatever. It's honestly, whatever you think about him, it does seem like he's sort of having a good time. Maybe that's what it is for him. I don't know. There was he found a bunch of like "Stay Woke" t-shirts in the back room at Twitter. I don't know, did you see this? And he posted a video like what I found. And then the next post was a t-shirt with the same shirt, "Stay Woke." It was, but hashtag "Stay at Work."
That's pretty good.
Funny. And that just drove people so mad. It's like, why are we so invested? Like, who cares, you guys? But anyway, so funny.
Exactly.
My original thought, again, having maybe 0.5% of my emotion even wrapped up in caring about it, is Twitter was already a huge cesspool. Like, I can't imagine whatever he's gonna do, whatever you think about him, it's gonna be worse than it already has been. So I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, well, bro, I gotta hop on a plane here in a few minutes.
Yeah.
So it was great talking to you again. The book is Analog Christian: Cultivating Contentment, Resilience, and Wisdom in the Digital Age. For my YouTubers, this is the cool cover, which looks a lot like your other book. Is that was intentional? I assume.
The books kind of live in they're siblings.
Yeah. Well, dude, you're kind of my go-to when it comes to stuff like this. So I'm super glad you're still writing and speaking on it. So thank you for your work, and hang in there, Pastor Kim.
Yeah. Thanks, Preston. Appreciate it, man.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.